Last month I had the privilege of participating in the first ever United Nations General Assembly forum on what it characterized as a resurgence of an alarming global anti-Semitism. And this meeting itself took place on the occasion of an important moment of remembrance and reminder. It took place on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, the most brutal extermination camp of the 20th century, of horrors too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened. 1.3 million people were murdered at Auschwitz. 1.1 million of them were Jews. Let there be no mistake about it, Mr. Speaker. Jews died at Auschwitz because of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism did not die. And as we have learned tragically and only too well, while it may begin with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And once again, in France and elsewhere, Jews are the canary in the mineshaft of global evil. Ceci a été démontré de façon claire et tragique par les récents attentats en France, notamment au supermarché hyper caché et au centre communautaire juif de Nice, et les attentats en Argentine, et plus récemment par la fusillade lors de la célébration d'une bar mitzvah à Copenhague. Pourtant, ces incidents ne sont que la plus récente manifestation d'une montée plus généralisée de l'antisémitisme en Europe et à travers le monde. And so, Mr. Speaker, may I share with you some thoughts, and with this Assembly this evening, some thoughts, some reflections, and some concerns on the Jewish condition and the human condition, about assaults on Jews and assaults on human rights, about the state of Jews in the world today, and about the state of the world inhabited by Jews, of anti-Semitism as the paradigm of radical hate, as the Holocaust is the paradigm of radical evil. My underlying thesis this evening, simply put, and as I shared it at the UN General Assembly, is that we are witnessing a developing, somewhat incrementally, imperceptibly, and often indulgently, and we've been witnessing this now for 40 years, an old, new, escalating, global, sophisticated, virulent, and even lethal anti-Semitism, but one now held to be reminiscent of some of the atmospherics of the 30s and without parallel or precedent in its global configuration since the end of the Second World War. This new anti-Jewishness overlaps with classical anti-Semitism. The member for Ottawa Centre spoke about definitions and frameworks, and I'll try to share some. Overlaps with classical anti-Semitism, but is distinguishable from it. It's found early juridical and even institutional international expression in the United Nations Zionism is Racism resolution, which the late U.S. Senator Daniel Moynihan said gave the abomination of anti-Semitism the appearance of international legal sanction, but it has gone dramatically beyond that. It almost needs a new vocabulary to define it, but can best be defined using an anti-discrimination, equality rights, international law perspective, which I hope to share with you this evening. In a word, traditional or classical anti-Semitism is a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the rights of Jews to live as equal members of whatever society or state they inhabit. The new anti-Semitism involves a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the right of the Jews as a people to live as an equal member of the family of nations, or their right even to live, with Israel as the targeted collective Jew among the nations. The first indicator and the most lethal manifestation of it is what might be called genocidal anti-Semitism. These are not words that I use idly, lightly, or easily. I'm referring here to the Genocide Convention's prohibition against the direct and public incitement to genocide, which caused our Supreme Court of Canada to write that, and I quote, "The Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers, it began with words." And in a more recent judgment, in the Mugesera judgment, court again said incitement to genocide is a crime in and of itself, whether or not acts of genocide follow. Regrettably, Mr. Chairman, we have seen 4 manifestations of this genocidal anti-Semitism, which reached a tipping point in the wake of the Hamas terrorist war against Israel this past summer. The first is the state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide in Khamenei's Iran. And I use this term to distinguish it from the people and publics of Iran who are otherwise the targets of mass domestic repression. Second manifestation is the covenant and charters of such terrorist movements as Hamas, whose charter continues to call publicly for the destruction of Israel and the killing of Jews wherever they may be. And if this is known, perhaps the anti-Semitic tropes in that charter are not. In other words, the Hamas charter is replete with such anti-Semitic tropes as the Jew are responsible for the French Revolution, for the First World War, for the Second World War, for the League of Nations, for the United Nations, for the end of the Islamic Caliphate. There was no war, they conclude, that broke out anywhere without the fingerprints of the Jews upon it. A third manifestation has been the religious fatwas, or genocidal calls by radical imams, and I distinguish this from mainstream Islam, I distinguish that from Islam, a kind of perversion of Islam. But we saw this from various mosques in Berlin, in Paris, in the UK, and the like, which publicly called themselves for the killing of Jews, where Jews and Judaism were characterized as perfidious enemies of Islam, where the Jews became, as it were, the Salman Rushdie of the nations. Finally, there were the hate-filled demonstrations in Europe this summer and since, which I personally witnessed myself, Mr. Chairman, replete with genocidal chants of Jews, Jews to the gas, joined with or followed by the torching of synagogues, the attacks on Jewish community centers, attacks on Jewish identifiable people and places, which caused the president of Germany's Central Council of Jews to say to me in Berlin when we met in November, and I quote, "These are the worst times since the Nazi era. On the streets, you hear things like, the Jews should be gassed, the Jews should be burned." The second indicator is the globalizing indictment of Israel and the Jewish people as the embodiment of all evil, as being racist, imperialist, colonialist, ethnic, child-killing, genocidal, Nazi people and state. The embodiment of all the worst evils of the 20th century and constitutive of all evils in the 21st century. One of the more disturbing indicators of the old-new anti-Semitism is the laundering or masking of that anti-Semitism under universal public values. In other words, under the protective cover of the United Nations, under the authority of international law, under the culture of human rights, and the struggle against racism, which reflect and represent all values held dearly by members in this House. For example, and I'll give just one example of each, with regard to the protective cover of the United Nations, in December, the UN General Assembly adopted 20 resolutions of condemnation against one member state of the international community. It happened to be Israel. 4 resolutions of condemnation against the rest of the world combined. The singling out of one member state for differential and discriminatory indictment. In the month of December, and here in the matter of invoking the authority of international law, the state parties to the Geneva Convention, the protector of international humanitarian law, put one state in the docket for only the 3rd time in the last 50 years. That state, for all 3 times in the last 50 years, happens to have been Israel. Rwanda, Darfur, it did not make a difference. The only state ever brought before the docket, the Geneva Convention, was Israel. And the third was what my colleague referred to in terms of the United Nations Human Rights Council, the protector for human rights, something that we subscribe to as well. 50% of all its resolutions are condemnatory of one state. 50% of its special sessions are condemnatory of one state. And I'll conclude by saying, Mr. Chairman, I spoke and appeared before the UN Human Rights Council. I can tell you that when you look at the agenda item of every meeting of that UN Human Rights Council, agenda item 7 says human rights violations by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. Agenda item 8, human rights violations in the rest of the world.